Everyone knows about the Peaky Blinders from the television show. The perfectly tailored suits, the slow-motion swagger, the cigarettes and whiskey, and Tommy Shelby's icy blue stare. They are frozen in time as working-class anti-heroes, beautiful outlaws fighting oppression with style. But here's what they do not tell you. The real gang was nothing like that glorious image. It got uglier, messier, and far more brutal than any television show would dare to depict. Let me take you back to where this really began, because the Peaky Blinders you think you know never actually existed. The real gang emerged in the 1880s, not the 1920s. There were no tailored suits, no political machinations, no international smuggling operations. These were boys, some as young as 12 or 13, born into the absolute worst slums Victorian England had produced. Birmingham in 1885 was hell on earth for the working poor. Families of 8 crammed into single-room houses with no running water, no sewage system, working 12-hour shifts in factories that regularly killed or maimed their employees. The city produced guns and machinery for the British Empire, while its own children starved in the streets. The real Peaky Blinders controlled maybe 6 or 7 streets in the Small Heath and Cheapside areas. Their territory could be walked end to end in 20 minutes. They did not negotiate with politicians or run sophisticated betting operations. They beat people for pocket change, stole bicycles, demanded pennies from shopkeepers too afraid to refuse. Historical court records show arrests for assault, petty theft, public drunkenness. In 1891, gang member Harry Fowles was arrested for stealing a pocket watch worth 2 shillings. In 1893, George Eastwood was jailed for 6 months for attacking a man who looked at him wrong in a pub. These were not masterminds, these were thugs. But the violence? That part the television show actually undersells, though it romanticizes how it happened. The real Peaky Blinders did not kill with style or purpose. They maimed for sport. One documented case from 1896 describes a victim whose face was slashed open from ear to mouth because he had won money from a gang member in a card game. The wound required 30 stitches and left him permanently disfigured. Unable to work, his family pushed into even deeper poverty. Another case involved a young woman, 17 years old, beaten so badly for rejecting a gang member's advances that she lost hearing in one ear. The courts recorded these crimes in clinical detail. The victims had names, families, futures, destroyed. And their weapons? Yes, they really did sew razor blades into their flat caps, though historians debate how often they actually used them versus just claiming they did to build fear. But here is what the show never tells you. Those caps were not fashion statements. They were the cheapest headwear available, cloth caps every working man in Birmingham wore because they could not afford anything else. The razors were not military grade or specially made. They were straight razors stolen from barbershops or taken from their own father's shaving kits. Everything about the real Peaky Blinders screamed poverty, not power. The gang peaked around 1897 with maybe 40 to 60 active members. Compare that to the sprawling criminal empire of the television show. Most real members were in their teens or early 20s. By their mid-20s, those who survived were either in prison, had moved on to legitimate work, or were dead from disease, alcoholism, or violence. There was no retirement plan for real Peaky Blinders. There was no building a legacy. There was just survival, day after day, in a city that wanted them dead or locked away. Now let me bring you to a specific moment that captures everything the television show refuses to acknowledge. Birmingham, 1896. A cold November night. A grocer named William Jenkins locked his shop on Bradford Street at 8 o'clock in the evening. He was 42 years old, father of 5 children, a man who worked 16 hours a day to keep his family fed. 3 members of the real Peaky Blinders had demanded 3 shillings a week for protection. William had refused. Not because he was brave, but because he literally could not afford it. Those 3 shillings were what he spent on bread for his children. They found him in the alley behind his shop. Thomas Mucklow, 19 years old, Edward Derrick, 17, and a third whose name was never recorded because he was only 14, and the courts protected juvenile identities. They did not give speeches about respect or loyalty. They did not offer him a second chance. They beat him until his face was unrecognizable, broke 3 of his ribs, and when he fell, they kicked him in the head until he stopped moving. Then, And this is the part that shows you who these people really were. They robbed his unconscious body. They took the 8 shillings he had earned that day, his pocket watch, and his wedding ring. They left him bleeding in the alley and went to a pub to drink away their earnings. William Jenkins survived, but he never fully recovered. He could not work for 6 months. His shop failed. His family was evicted from their home. 2 of his children were sent to the workhouse because he could not feed them. This was not a calculated business move. This was not strategic empire building. This was cruelty for 3 shillings and the temporary feeling of power it gave 3 boys who had none. But here is where it gets truly dark, where the real gang would absolutely despise how they are portrayed today. In 1897, the most brutal documented crime in Peaky Blinders history occurred, and it was not against a rival gang or corrupt police officer. It was against one of their own. A gang member named David Taylor, just 18 years old, was suspected of talking to police about a robbery. There was no trial, no investigation to determine if this was true. The gang decided he was a traitor, and what they did to him was so horrific that even other criminals testified against them in court. They found David on a Saturday night, dragged him into an alley off Cheapside, and beat him with metal bars and fists for nearly 20 minutes. Court testimony describes how his screams woke entire neighborhoods, how people were too terrified to intervene. When they finished, David Taylor had a fractured skull, broken ribs, a shattered jaw, and injuries so severe he could not walk for 3 months. He was not killed, which would have been a mercy. He was left alive as a message, permanently brain damaged, unable to work, a burden on his already destitute family for the rest of his short life. He died 2 years later from complications related to his injuries. He was 20 years old. This was the real Peaky Blinders, not noble outlaws fighting oppression, not working-class heroes standing up to the system. They were the system's victims turned victimizers, destroying their own communities because they had no other outlet for their rage and desperation. But here is the plot twist that changes everything about that story. The police who finally arrested the men responsible for attacking David Taylor, the officers who were praised in newspapers for bringing these criminals to justice, they were on the payroll of a rival gang from the Digbeth area. Yes, you heard that correctly. The very police who arrested them were themselves corrupt, but not in the grand, sophisticated way the television show depicts, with chief inspectors playing political chess. No, these were beat cops taking a few shillings a week to look the other way when certain criminals operated and to crack down hard on their competition. The corruption was as petty and pathetic as everything else about real gang life in Birmingham. This was not some vast conspiracy reaching into Parliament. This was desperate men in every direction, police included, trying to squeeze a few extra coins out of the nightmare they all lived in. And the most disturbing part of all? This was not even the worst thing the real Peaky Blinders did to their own people. What they did to a 14-year-old boy named James Murphy in 1898 makes the David Taylor beating look merciful. And the reason they did it will make you understand exactly why these real criminals would hate being turned into heroes on your television screen. James Murphy was 14 years old when he joined the Peaky Blinders in 1897. He was not recruited with promises of brotherhood or loyalty like the television show depicts. He was hungry. His father had died in a factory accident, crushed between 2 pieces of machinery, and the factory owner paid his widow exactly nothing in compensation. James needed money to help feed his 3 younger siblings, and the gang offered the fastest route to cash. For 6 months, he ran errands, delivered messages, stood watch while older members committed robberies. He was paid in pennies and the occasional stolen food. He thought he had found a way to survive. In March of 1898, James was arrested for pickpocketing. The police caught him stealing a wallet from a man outside a pub. It was his first arrest, and he was terrified. The police questioned him for 3 hours in a cold cell, and James, still just a child, broke down and cried. He did not intentionally inform on the gang. He did not give names or specific crimes, but he mentioned in his fear and confusion that he had been with older boys when a shop was robbed 2 weeks earlier. He did not know that this single, vague admission would seal his fate. The police let James go with a warning because of his age. He returned to Small Heath thinking he had escaped punishment. But someone had been watching the police station, as gang members often did, to see who got arrested and who got released too quickly. Word spread that James had been inside for 3 hours, far longer than a simple pickpocketing charge should take. The assumption was made, as it always was in that world, that he had talked. The truth did not matter. Suspicion was enough. They came for him on a Thursday evening, 5 days after his release. James was walking home from a church where he had gone to beg for food. 3 gang members, including one he considered a friend, grabbed him off the street and dragged him to an abandoned warehouse near the canal. What happened next was documented in court records from the trial that followed, testimony so disturbing that the judge cleared the public gallery and forbade newspapers from printing the full details. They tortured James Murphy for information he did not have. They wanted names of who else might be informing, details about what he had told the police, confirmation of their paranoid suspicions. James had nothing to tell them because he had barely said anything to the police at all. But his denials were taken as lies, his tears as proof of guilt. They beat him with boards and fists. They burned him with cigarettes. They broke his fingers one by one, trying to make him confess to betrayals he had never committed. The torture lasted over an hour. When they finally realized he truly had nothing more to tell them, they faced a decision. They could not let him go because he had seen their faces, heard them admit to crimes, witnessed their brutality. But they also could not bring themselves to kill a 14-year-old boy. Not because of morality, but because even in their world, murdering a child would bring heat from the police they could not afford. So they chose a third option, one that still haunts the historical record. They dumped James Murphy, barely conscious and broken, on the steps of Birmingham General Hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. They left him there like garbage. His body so damaged, the doctors initially thought he would die. He did not die. He survived, but his left hand never worked properly again. 3 fingers permanently curled and useless. His hearing was damaged. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And because he was too afraid to testify, because he knew they would kill him and his family if he spoke in court, only 1 gang member was ever arrested, and he served just 18 months in prison. This is what the real Peaky Blinders did to a child. From their own neighborhood, from their own community, from families just as poor and desperate as their own. There was no honor in this. There was no code. There was only fear and violence maintaining itself through more fear and violence. But here is the second plot twist that will make you see everything differently. That 1 gang member who was arrested and served 18 months, his name was Robert Wade, and he was 17 years old when he participated in torturing James Murphy. When Robert was released from prison in 1900, he did not return to the gang. He could not. The Peaky Blinders had dissolved while he was locked away, their members scattered by police crackdowns and their own internal paranoia. Robert Wade got a job in a factory, married, had children, and lived a completely ordinary life until he died in 1949. In his final year of life, suffering from lung cancer and knowing he would not survive, Robert Wade gave a confession to a local priest. That confession was preserved in church records and later found by historians. In it, Robert expressed not remorse for what he did to James Murphy, but confusion about why anyone would celebrate the gang he had been part of. He described the Peaky Blinders as, quote, "the worst thing that ever happened to Birmingham, a plague of our own making, boys destroying boys because we knew nothing else." He said the violence was not about power or respect. It was about feeling, even for a moment, like you were not the lowest thing in the world. It was about making someone else hurt the way you hurt every single day. This is why the real Peaky Blinders would hate the television show. Not because it gets the dates wrong or exaggerates their influence, but because it transforms their worst impulses, their most shameful acts, their complete moral failures into entertainment. It makes their victims invisible and their violence beautiful. It gives meaning to actions that had no meaning, purpose to cruelty that was only ever about survival and desperation. The show depicts Tommy Shelby having philosophical conversations about class warfare and political revolution. The real Peaky Blinders could barely read and had no political consciousness beyond resentment. The show depicts carefully planned operations and strategic thinking. The real gang operated on impulse and paranoia. The show depicts loyalty and brotherhood. The real gang turned on each other constantly, destroyed their own members, left children broken and families ruined. And what about James Murphy, the 14-year-old boy whose torture I just described? He lived until 1963. He worked as a street sweeper for 40 years, one of the only jobs his damaged body could perform. He never married. He never had children. He lived alone in a boarding house and drank heavily to manage the pain that never fully went away. When local historians began romanticizing the Peaky Blinders in the 1950s, writing nostalgic newspaper articles about the colorful gang characters of old Birmingham, James Murphy wrote one letter to the editor. It was never published, but it survived in archives. The letter said, quote, "They were not characters, they were criminals. They destroyed lives, mine included. I was a child and they broke me for nothing, for their own fear and stupidity. There is nothing romantic about what they did, nothing worth remembering except as a warning." But even that warning was ignored because the legend was already more appealing than the truth. Now here is what will truly disturb you about all of this. The real Peaky Blinders did not end with some dramatic final battle or last stand. They did not go out in a blaze of glory. They simply faded away, destroyed not by rivals or police, but by something far more mundane and far more devastating. And what that was, what actually killed the real Peaky Blinders, reveals the final truth about why these men would despise being turned into the heroes you see on television. The real Peaky Blinders ended not with gunfire or epic confrontation, but with something the television show would never dare to depict because it is too pathetic, too anticlimactic, too honest about what these men actually were. They ended because they got old, because the world changed around them, and because even their own children wanted nothing to do with what they represented. By 1900, the core members of the gang were in their late 20s and early 30s. In the world they inhabited, this made them ancient. Most had spent time in prison. Many had injuries that never healed properly, infections that weakened them, alcoholism that destroyed their bodies faster than the violence ever could. Thomas Mucklow, the 19-year-old who beat grocer William Jenkins in that alley, was dead by 1903 at age 26 from tuberculosis contracted in prison. Harry Fowles, arrested for stealing a pocket watch, was killed in 1901 during a drunken fight with a man who was not even part of any gang. The younger members who might have carried on the gang's legacy made a different choice. They had watched their older brothers destroy themselves for nothing. When factories began offering slightly better wages in the early 1900s, when social reforms slowly started to provide minimal safety nets, the new generation chose differently. They chose boring, hard, legitimate work over the glamorous criminal life that had never actually been glamorous at all. This is the real reason the Peaky Blinders dissolved. Not because they were defeated by a worthy opponent, they dissolved because even the people who grew up surrounded by them could see it was a dead end. The gang's own children looked at their fathers, broken and bitter and poor despite years of crime, and said no. We will take the factory job. We will take the predictable poverty of honest work over the chaotic poverty of crime. By 1910, the name Peaky Blinders was still used occasionally in Birmingham, but it referred to scattered individuals with no real organization, no continuity with the original gang. The police had also changed their tactics. New laws gave them greater power to crack down on street gangs. Longer prison sentences became standard. The petty corruption that had allowed gangs to operate was slowly being addressed because Birmingham's business leaders realized gang violence was bad for commerce. But here is the second major twist that will change everything you thought you knew. In 1962, a man named Stephen McHickey died in a nursing home in Birmingham at age 87. Stephen had been a Peaky Blinder. He joined the gang in 1894 when he was 19 years old. He participated in robberies, assaults, protection rackets. He served 2 prison sentences. Stephen left the gang in 1900 when he married, and he spent the next 62 years working as a laborer, raising 4 children, living an unremarkable working-class life. In his final months, Stephen's grandson would visit him and ask about the old days. The grandson had heard rumors that his grandfather had been part of the famous Peaky Blinders. By 1962, local historians had already begun romanticizing the gang, turning them into folklore, into colorful characters from Birmingham's rough but authentic past. The grandson expected exciting stories of daring robberies and noble outlaws. What he got instead was something very different. Stephen McHickey's final testimony about the Peaky Blinders was recorded by his grandson in a journal later donated to Birmingham Archives. In it, Stephen describes the gang as, quote, "the greatest shame of my life. A group of terrified boys pretending to be men by hurting people weaker than ourselves. We accomplished nothing. We built nothing. We protected no one. We were parasites feeding on our own community." He described the violence not as strategic but as random and excessive, fueled by alcohol and rage and the deep humiliation of poverty. He said the worst part was the waste of it all. Quote, "We could have organized for better wages. We could have fought the factory owners who were truly destroying us. We could have built something real. Instead, we turned on each other and on people just as poor as we were. We were doing the boss's work for them, keeping our own people down." This is the voice of a real Peaky Blinder, not filtered through television writers. This is a man who lived that life and spent 60 years trying to make up for it. And his final message was not pride, but warning against glorifying it. Stephen McKickey saw the early romanticization of the Peaky Blinders in the 1950s and 60s. He saw newspaper articles calling them local legends, symbols of Birmingham's tough working-class spirit. And it disgusted him. In one of his final conversations with his grandson, he said, quote, "They are making us into heroes, but we were not heroes. We were the villains in our own neighborhood story. We made life worse for everyone, including ourselves. If people want to remember us, they should remember us as a warning, not as something to celebrate." But his warning was not heeded because the legend was already more powerful than the truth. The romantic version was more appealing than the reality of desperate, brutal violence. By the time the television show premiered decades later, the transformation was complete. The real Peaky Blinders had been erased and replaced with fictional characters who shared nothing with them except a name. Now remember William Jenkins, the grocer from the beginning? Let me tell you the rest of his story. William survived that beating, but his life was destroyed. His shop failed. His family was evicted. 2 of his children were sent to the workhouse. His wife had to take factory work under conditions so dangerous she lost 3 fingers in a machinery accident. In 1924, William Jenkins' youngest son, Robert Jenkins, became a police officer in Birmingham. Robert had been 7 years old when his father was beaten. He had watched his family fall apart. He had spent 2 years in the workhouse, and when he grew up, he dedicated his career to making sure gangs like the Peaky Blinders could never operate again. Robert Jenkins worked in Birmingham police for 35 years and was decorated multiple times. When Robert died in 1967, his obituary mentioned his devotion to law enforcement after his father was victimized by gang violence. But Robert's children knew the full story. They knew their grandfather had been beaten by the gang that television would soon make into heroes. And they knew the real legacy was not style or rebellion, but broken bodies and broken families and trauma that echoed through generations. This is why the real Peaky Blinders would hate the television show, not because of dates or locations, but because the show erases their victims. It erases William Jenkins and his family. It erases James Murphy, the 14-year-old boy tortured for nothing. It erases David Taylor, attacked by his own gang and dead at 20. It erases all the ordinary people who suffered. The show gives the gang a code of honor they never had, a political consciousness they never possessed, a legacy worth preserving when their only real legacy was pain. And it makes the violence beautiful. The slow-motion fights, the artful blood, the glinting razors. The real violence was not beautiful. It was ugly and desperate. It was lives destroyed for no reason, communities torn apart, decades of trauma for temporary feelings of power that evaporated immediately. Stephen McKickey said it best in his final words. Quote, "I was 19 and I hurt someone badly. I felt powerful for maybe 10 minutes, then I felt sick for the rest of my life. There was no philosophy, no grand plan, just a stupid, angry boy causing harm, because I did not know any other way to feel like I mattered. And now people want to make that into entertainment. It makes me want to scream." That is the voice of truth. That is what the real Peaky Blinders were. And that is why they would hate being turned into the stylish, heroic figures you see on television. The show is a moral inversion, taking the worst of human behavior and transforming it into aspiration. So the next time you watch Tommy Shelby in slow motion, remember the real people. Remember James Murphy, broken at 14. Remember Stephen McKickey, carrying shame until death. Remember William Jenkins, whose family was destroyed over 3 shillings. That is the real story the television show will never tell you. And that is why the real Peaky Blinders would beg you to turn it off.